The name hit the air like a gunshot in a church. Pauline Ramsey had not meant to say it. She had not even known she was going to say it until the word was already out of her mouth, hanging there between her and Frank Rhodes in the amber light of the oil lamp, irretrievable as a bullet already fired. She watched something happen to his face that she had never seen happen to any man's face before. It was not anger, though anger would have been easier to understand. It was not grief, though grief lived somewhere inside it. It was the look of a man who had been standing very still for a very long time, holding something enormous in place by sheer force of will, and who had just felt that thing shift. He set down the tin cup he had been holding. He set it down with great care, as though the careful setting down of a tin cup was the only thing keeping the world from splitting open. "I have not spoken that name aloud in years," he said, and she did not ask him to explain. The fire crackled in the iron stove. Wind drove hard against the single window of the lined shack. Outside, the New Mexico Territory night pressed down on everything, vast and indifferent and cold. The kind of cold that came down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in early November of 1882, and reminded a person that this land had existed long before they arrived, and would exist long after they were gone. Pauline sat very still on the three-legged stool she had dragged to the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and she watched Frank Rhodes stand at the window with his back to her, and she understood without being told that something had just changed between them. She did not know yet whether it had changed for better or worse. She only knew that the hidden motive she had suspected in him, since the moment he had found her 3 days ago, half dead on the Cimarron road with her wagon overturned and her horse gone, and the cold settling into her bones like a slow-moving enemy, was not what she had imagined it to be. She had imagined something mercenary. She had imagined something selfish. She had not imagined whatever this was. Whatever this was felt like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. It had started, as so many things in her life had started, with a letter she wished she had never written. Pauline Ramsey had come west on the Santa Fe Railroad in the last week of October 1882, stepping off at Springer, New Mexico Territory, with a single trunk, $32 folded into the lining of her corset, and the name and address of one Gerald Holt written on a piece of paper she kept tucked in her left glove. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Galena, Illinois, in a house that had once been prosperous and was now merely maintained, kept upright by the determined effort of her widowed mother and the income from Pauline's work as a seamstress. She had answered an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune, one of the many advertisements that appeared in the back pages of newspapers across the country in those years, men in the territories seeking wives, women in the cities seeking escape. She had told herself it was a practical decision. She had told herself she was not running from anything. Both of these things were partially true, and neither of them was entirely true, which is the way of most important decisions a person makes. Gerald Holt was described in his advertisement as a rancher of some means, sober in habits, 38 years of age, requiring a capable woman to manage his household and share in the building of a life in the territory. He had written her 2 letters that were not unpleasant. He had a straightforward way of expressing himself, and he did not make promises that seemed impossible. She had found in those 2 letters enough to hold on to. She had not found love. She had not been looking for love. Love, as she understood it at 26, was a luxury that had not been available in her particular life, in the same way that velvet curtains and sterling silver had not been available. She understood that some people had these things. She did not count herself among them. The journey from Springer to Gerald Holt's ranch, some 40 miles south and west, was to be made by wagon. A man named Cribbs had been hired to drive her out, and for the first day the journey went smoothly enough, the landscape opening around her in a way that was simultaneously frightening and beautiful. The red clay earth and the sage and the distant mountains stacked against the sky like enormous sleeping animals. Pauline sat beside Cribbs on the wagon bench and watched New Mexico Territory unfold and felt something in her chest that she could not name, something between excitement and dread, and a third thing that had no word. On the second day, everything went wrong. The road dipped down into a dry arroyo crossing, and something startled the horses, and the wagon went over. It happened faster than thinking. One moment she was reaching to grip the bench rail. The next she was lying in the rocky bed of the arroyo with the cold wind on her face, and the overturned wagon above her, and no sign of Cribs. She would learn later that Cribs had broken his leg in the fall and had been found by a passing rider and taken back toward Springer. What she knew in the moment was that she was alone, that one of her ankles was badly wrenched and possibly cracked, that her trunk was inaccessible beneath the wagon, and that the temperature was dropping. She had pulled herself to the side of the road. She had wrapped herself in the one blanket she had managed to salvage from the wagon bed. She had tried to remain calm, which was harder than it sounded when the light was failing and the wind was picking up, and no one knew exactly where she was. She had been there for the better part of a night and a morning when Frank Rhodes found her. She had heard the horse first, a sound so welcome she had actually wept, though she was not a woman who wept easily or often. Then the horse had appeared over the lip of the arroyo, and the man on it had looked down at her with an expression she could not read in her half-delirious state, and he had said, "How bad is it?" in a voice that was low and measured and entirely without the kind of performative concern that would have irritated her even in her current state. She had told him the ankle was bad and she was cold. He had said, "Can you ride?" She had said she thought so. He had helped her up onto his horse with an efficiency that was not unkind and a steadiness that she would think about later, when she had the capacity to think about anything. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and did not eat regularly enough, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been weathered by years of sun and wined into something angular and permanent, like a landform. She guessed he was in his middle 30s. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that she would later decide was the color of creek water in autumn, dark and clear and carrying something beneath the surface. He had taken her to the line shack. He had explained in the brief and practical way that she was coming to understand, was simply how he communicated, that he was a rancher working land about 12 miles east, that this line shack was on the edge of his property, that the weather was turning, and they could not make it to either Springer or to Holt's ranch before the storm hit. He had said this without apology and without excessive elaboration, in the tone of a man reporting facts that could not be argued with because they were simply facts. She had said, "I am expected at Gerald Holt's ranch." He had said, "Gerald Holt's ranch will still be there when the storm passes." There had been something in his voice when he said Gerald Holt's name. Something so subtle she was not certain she had heard it at all, in her exhausted and half-frozen state. A slight tightening, a controlled flatness. She filed it away without examining it. He had made a fire. He had heated water and brought her what food he had, hardtack and dried salt beef and coffee so strong it tasted like the earth itself, and she had eaten it all without complaint because she was hungry enough to be grateful for anything. He had examined her ankle with careful hands, confirmed it was badly sprained rather than broken, wrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth torn from what appeared to be his spare shirt, and told her not to put weight on it for at least 2 days. She had asked his name. "Frank Rhodes," he said. She had told him hers. "I know who you are," he said, which was the first strange thing. She had looked at him directly for the first time then, studying his face for something that would tell her what he meant by that, but his face gave her nothing that she could read yet. She was not yet fluent in his face. That fluency would come, but it would take time, and in those early hours she was working with an alphabet she did not fully understand. "You know who I am," she repeated. "You're the woman coming to marry Gerald Holt," he said. "Word travels in small country." This was true enough. She had not pushed it further. The storm had come in hard that first night, snow driven sideways by wind, and the line shack, which was barely adequate in fair weather, became a small miracle of warmth in comparison to what was outside its walls. Frank Rhodes slept on the floor near the door, his saddle for a pillow, his coat over him, and she slept on the bunk, and she listened to the storm and to his quiet breathing and felt the strange suspended quality of a life held in parentheses between where it had been and where it was going. The second day the storm continued. They talked, in the fitful and circling way of two people confined together by weather who are not sure of the rules governing their situation. He told her about the land, about the ranch he was building, about the particular difficulty of running cattle in the territory in a dry year. He was not a man who volunteered personal information, but he was not a man who deflected direct questions either, and she found herself asking more of them than she would normally have asked a stranger, because there was something in his careful economy of words that made each answer feel like something genuinely given rather than performed. She told him about Galena, about her mother, about the seamstress work, and what it was like to spend your days with your hands in someone else's fabric making something beautiful that you would never wear. She told him about the advertisement and the letters, and she was honest about the fact that she was not arriving in New Mexico territory in the grip of romantic feeling. He had listened to all of this with the quality of attention that was, she was beginning to understand, his most remarkable characteristic. Not the attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the attention of a man who actually wanted to know what she was saying. "Are you afraid of him?" Frank asked on the second evening. Holt, she had considered the question carefully. "I don't know him well enough to be afraid of him," she said. "I know him well enough to be uncertain." "That's a fair answer," Frank said. "Is there something about him I should know?" she asked. And that was when it happened, the silence, the particular loaded quality of a silence that contains more than silence, and she had said without quite meaning to, trying to fill the space. Holt mentioned a partner once in one of his letters. Someone who left the territory some years back. Someone named, and she had said the name she had glimpsed only once at the bottom of a letter Holt had written, a name she had not thought was significant. And Frank Rhodes had gone absolutely still. "I have not spoken that name aloud in years," he said, and she did not ask him to explain. She did not ask because something in the way he said it told her that asking would be the wrong thing to do. There are moments in a person's acquaintance with another person when you feel the presence of something enormous and buried, something that has been carried for a long time, and that has changed the shape of the person carrying it the way water changes the shape of stone. You can push at such a thing and drive it deeper, or you can simply acknowledge it with your silence and wait to see what it does on its own. Pauline Ramsey had always been, despite the hard practical edges of her life, a woman who understood the value of waiting. Frank did not go to his floorbed that night. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the darkness where the storm was finally beginning to ease, and Pauline sat on her stool and tended the fire and let the silence be what it needed to be. After a long time he said, "Thomas Aldridge." She looked at him. "That was the name," he said, "Thomas Aldridge." She did not say anything. "He was my partner," Frank said. Before I came here, before I had this land." He stopped. He picked up his cup and then put it down again. "We built something together, in Arizona territory. We built it from nothing, the way you build things in this country, with your hands and your back and the kind of belief that has nothing reasonable backing it up. It took 5 years. At the end of those 5 years it was something worth having." He looked at the window through the dark glass. "Then he took it, everything, the deed, the cattle, the money we had in the bank in Tucson. He forged the paperwork, paid 2 witnesses to swear to whatever he needed sworn to, and by the time I understood what had happened, there was nothing left that the law would help me recover." Pauline felt the weight of this settle into the room like something physical. "He had been my closest friend," Frank said. "For 11 years before that. We had ridden together since we were 22 years old." The betrayal in those words was not performed. It was the simple factual reporting of a man who had processed his grief over many years and arrived at a place where he could state it without theater, but where the absence of theater did not mean the absence of depth. If anything, the quiet steadiness of it was more devastating than anger would have been. "What happened after?" Pauline asked, because this felt like a question he would be able to answer. "I left," he said. "I came east, New Mexico territory. I found this land and I started again." A slight pause. "Gerald Holt was one of the men who backed me. He had capital. I had knowledge. It was supposed to be a business arrangement." She understood now the quality of his voice when he had said Holt's name earlier. "Supposed to be," she said. "Holt found ways to take more than his agreed share," Frank said. "Nothing I could prove. The kind of man who understands exactly how far he can push something without leaving a mark you can show to a judge." He looked at her for the first time in a while, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite an apology but was in the direction of one. "I am not trying to influence you," he said. "You came here with a plan. I'm not standing in the way of your plan." "You are telling me things that are relevant to my plan," Pauline said. "Yes," he said, "I am doing that." "Then I'd rather know them than not," she said. The fire settled, sending up a small shower of sparks. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the silence was the particular silence of new snow, absolute and clean, erasing everything it covered. "Thomas Aldridge ended up here," Frank said. "That's what the name in Holt's letter means." "They know each other. I don't know the nature of it. I only know I heard Aldridge's name spoken in Springer 2 months ago by a man who'd come down from Colorado, and I know that Holt has been acquiring land to the north and west in ways that don't always follow a straight line." Pauline sat with all of this for a long moment. "And I am the woman Holt advertised for," she said slowly, turning it over, examining it the way you examine a piece of fabric to find the flaw. "A woman coming with no connections in the territory. No family. No one who would ask questions." Frank said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "You think he has a dark past and he is building towards something," she said. "And that I am a piece of the building." "I think it is possible," he said carefully. "I think you should know that it is possible." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was burning low and his face was half in shadow, and she was sitting very straight on the three-legged stool with her wrapped ankle extended before her, and she thought about the $32 in her corset, and the trunk that was still under an overturned wagon in an arroyo, and the plan she had made in Galena in the conviction that the future could be managed if you approached it methodically. "I am not going to Holt's ranch," she said. Frank looked at her. "Not until I understand what I would be walking into," she said. "Not alone and not with an injured ankle and not without more information than I currently have." She met his eyes steadily. "I am not a foolish woman, Mr. Rhodes. I came west because I had limited options, not because I had no judgment." Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile exactly, but it was in the vicinity of one. "No," he said, "I don't think you're a foolish woman." In the morning the world was covered in 6 inches of snow, and the sky was the particular hard blue that comes after a storm, the kind of blue that seems to have been scrubbed clean. Frank saddled his horse and rode to Springer himself, returning the following afternoon with a wagon he had borrowed from a man named Price, and with Pauline's trunk retrieved from where the salvage crew had stored it, and with information about Cribbs's broken leg and recovery. He also brought back 2 things he had not mentioned when he left: a letter sent to the Springer post office in Pauline's name from Gerald Holt, and a look on his face when he returned that she had not seen before. "The letter," she said. "It arrived day before yesterday," he said. "The postmaster was holding it." She read it standing in the doorway of the lined shack with the cold air coming in around her. Holt's handwriting was neat and deliberate, the writing of a man who was careful about how he presented himself, and the words were polite enough on the surface. He expressed concern for her well-being. He mentioned that he had sent a man to look for her along the road. He expressed his hope that she would come to the ranch as soon as the weather permitted. But there was something in it. A particular word he used, investment, in the context of their prospective arrangement, that caught in her like a splinter. Not partnership, not future, investment. "What did you learn in Springer?" she asked Frank. He had learned that Thomas Aldridge had been seen in Cimarron 3 weeks ago. He had learned that Holt had recently registered a land deed that encompassed water rights on the creek that ran through Frank's eastern pasture, in a registration that had occurred 3 months ago without Frank's knowledge, despite the fact that those water rights had previously been agreed, verbally, to belong to both Holt and Rhodes jointly. He had learned that 2 men had come through Springer asking questions about a woman traveling from the railroad, and that their descriptions did not match any of Holt's known ranch hands. Pauline processed all of this with the focused attention she usually brought to complex sewing patterns. "He advertised for a wife," she said. "In Chicago and likely elsewhere. Specific advertisements, specific newspapers, choosing women with no family connections in the territory." "That's what I think," Frank said. "What is a wife legally in the territory?" she asked. Frank looked at her. "A wife's signature can be required on certain land transactions," he said slowly. "Property acquired during marriage, dower rights." A territorial judge who owed Holt a favor could interpret the law in ways that he stopped. "A wife who did not understand what she was signing," he said. "A wife from far away," Pauline said, "with no one to advise her." The full shape of the trap was becoming visible, the way a pattern emerges when you have enough pieces of it laid out on a table. She did not feel the fear of it yet, or rather she felt it and set it aside, because fear was not useful until you understood exactly what shape the threat was. "I need to send a letter," she said. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She wrote to the postmaster in Cimarron, asking for information about a man named Thomas Aldridge. She wrote a short, composed, carefully worded letter to Gerald Holt, saying that her ankle injury was more serious than initially hoped, and that she would remain in Springer under the care of the local doctor until she was able to travel. None of these things were entirely true, but none of them were without strategic justification. Frank watched her write all 3 letters at the small table in the lined shack, using the stub of a pencil and the paper he had brought back from Springer, and his expression was one she was beginning to recognize, the quiet, focused regard of a man who was taking serious inventory of what he was seeing. "You've got a clear head," he said when she finished. "I've had to," she said simply. They remained at the lined shack for 2 more days before she was confident enough on her ankle to make the ride to Frank's main ranch house. This was a practical decision, she told herself. The lined shack was adequate, but the main house would be more comfortable, and she would be better positioned to receive any correspondence she had sent out. This was all true, and it was not the only truth, but she was not yet prepared to examine the other truths too directly. Frank's ranch was called the Mesa Verde Claim, though it was not in the Mesa Verde country, the name being a private reference to some earlier chapter of his life that he did not explain, and she did not ask about. The house was low and built of adobe with a wooden porch that ran across the front of it, functional rather than ornamental, the house of a man who thought about shelter in terms of what it needed to do rather than how it needed to appear. There was a barn in better repair than the house, which told her something. There were 2 hands, brothers named Luis and Miguel Esperanza, who handled the daily work of the cattle operation, and who greeted her arrival with the careful courtesy of men who had not expected a woman, and were not entirely sure what to do with one. Luis brought her coffee the first morning without being asked, setting it on the table beside her with a nod, and she thanked him and he went back to his work, and she thought that this was a household that functioned without a great deal of ceremony, and that this was actually fine with her. Frank gave her the main bedroom and took the small room at the back of the house that served as a study and sleeping room combined. She did not argue this because her ankle still needed rest and because arguing would have been beside the point. On the 4th day at the ranch, a reply came from the land office in Santa Fe. She read it twice, standing in the cold kitchen with the November light coming through the window, and then she went to find Frank. He was in the barn, working on a harness, and he looked up when she came in and she handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw tighten. The land office letter confirmed that 3 parcels of land adjacent to Frank's eastern boundary had been registered in the past 18 months in the name of a Gerald Holt Land Trust, that these registrations included the water rights in question, and that a further registration was pending on 2 additional parcels, one of which appeared to overlap with Frank's own deed by approximately 40 acres on his northern boundary. "He's been moving the line," Frank said. "One piece at a time," Pauline said. "Slowly enough that you might not notice until he has everything he wants." Frank set the letter down on the workbench. He put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. She could see the control it was taking him to stay steady, the hidden cost of it, and she thought that this was a man who had been through something like this before and who understood exactly what it meant to watch something you had built begin to be taken from you. "I should have seen it," he said. "He was careful," she said. "Men like this are always careful." "Thomas Aldridge was careful too," Frank said, "and I didn't see that either until it was done." There was a dark quality to his voice, not self-pity, something harder than that, the voice of a man examining himself honestly and not finding the examination comfortable. She understood the impulse. She had had similar examinations of her own decisions. "The man who told you about Aldridge in Springer," she said, "can you find him again? His name is Carver. He has a claim north of town." "I want to know what Aldridge's connection to Holt is specifically," she said, "because if Aldridge is here and Holt knows him, that is not a coincidence." It was not a coincidence. They found this out when Frank rode to see Carver 2 days later, and returned in the late afternoon with a look on his face that told her the news was worse than they had hoped. Thomas Aldridge was Gerald Holt's attorney. He had been admitted to practice before the territorial courts in New Mexico 6 months ago, and he had set up in Cimarron, and he was the man who had been filing Holt's land registrations. The full architecture of the scheme became clear to Pauline in the way that a completed dress becomes visible when you finally hold up all the pieces together. Holt had the capital and the social position. Aldridge had the legal expertise and the willingness to bend territorial law in ways that would not obviously break it. Together they were acquiring land and water rights, and whatever else could be acquired in the slow, patient way of men who understood that the biggest thefts are the ones that happen gradually, in the language of official documents, in the spaces between what the law says and what the law does. And a wife, a legitimate wife with her signature available for whatever was needed, would complete the picture. "He advertised in Chicago specifically," Pauline said, "far enough away that no one here would know the woman. And he chose to advertise in the Tribune because it reaches women who are educated enough to be useful but who are desperate enough to come." Frank looked at her when she said this. There was something careful in his eyes. "You are not desperate," he said. "Don't let him make you feel that." "I am not letting him make me feel anything," she said steadily. "I am describing the calculation he made. It's different from agreeing with it." A long pause. "You're right," Frank said. "I'm sorry." The apology surprised her. Not because it was wrong, but because it was offered so cleanly, without qualification or defensiveness. The apology of a man who had recognized an error and corrected for it immediately. She found this more affecting than she would have expected. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, "before Holt becomes suspicious about my delay." "What are you thinking?" What she was thinking had been forming over the past several days, built from pieces, the way she built everything methodically without rushing, checking the logic at each join. She explained it to him. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That will work." "I know," she said. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this exactly, but you've handled things like this." "I've handled the version of this that exists in a small city," she said, "where the weapons are social rather than legal, but the principle is the same." The plan was this. Pauline would write to Holt saying she was recovered and prepared to come to the ranch. She would go, but not alone, and not without the letter she had drafted to a federal land office official in Santa Fe, a man named Deputy Commissioner Haverford, who handled territorial land disputes that had federal implications. This letter laid out, with the documentary evidence Frank had been collecting from county records over the past week at her direction, the specific nature of the registration, irregularities on Holt's filed deeds. The letter also named Thomas Aldridge by his previous name in Arizona Territory, detailing his known history of deed fraud there. This information was available in the public records of Pima County if you knew to look for it, and Frank had known to look for it, and had written to a former associate in Tucson who had been able to verify and document what they needed. The letter would go to Santa Fe before Pauline went to Holt's ranch. Its existence would be known to Holt because Pauline would tell him. He could simply have me removed, Frank said. Or worse. He could, Pauline agreed. Which is why we are not making this a private confrontation. We are making it a legal matter that is already in motion before either of us walks into that room. The deputy commissioner, Frank said. Haverford, do you know him? No, Pauline said, but the law is the law even when you don't know the people enforcing it. If we've documented it correctly, we have, Frank said. He had spent 3 nights at the table with the county record copies and he knew what they said. Then it proceeds without us. They sent the letter to Haverford by express rider on the morning of the 9th day. On the afternoon of the 10th day, Pauline wrote to Gerald Holt and told him she was on her way. Frank drove the wagon. Lewis rode alongside on horseback. The day was cold and bright. The snow from the earlier storm mostly melted except in the shadows of the red rock formations that lined the road south. And the land was enormous around them in the way that land in New Mexico territory is enormous, the kind of scale that makes human concerns seem briefly irrelevant, and then, when you look at the person beside you, makes them seem more real than anything else. Pauline sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap, and she was aware of Frank Rhodes sitting beside her with the reins in his hands and the winter sun on his face. And she thought about all the things she now knew about him that she had not known 10 days ago, about the 11-year friendship that had been betrayed, about the ranch in Arizona Territory that had been taken from him, about the careful way he had rebuilt himself in this place, and about the fact that he was driving her toward a man who had been doing to him, slowly and legally, the same thing Thomas Aldridge had done suddenly and criminally. She thought about the name that had come out of her mouth in the lamplight and the way his face had changed. She thought that she did not want to go to Gerald Holt's ranch. She thought that she wanted, with a clarity that surprised her, to stay. This was not a thought she was prepared to say aloud, because it was too new and too unexamined, and because the immediate situation required her full attention. But she was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has moved in your peripheral vision, not quite seen, but present and real. Gerald Holt's ranch was larger than Frank's, which she supposed was partly the point of everything. The main house was 2 stories and had glass in all its windows and a painted porch with a rail, the house of a man who wanted to be seen to have arrived. Holt himself came out to meet the wagon, and she understood immediately why his letters had seemed reasonable. He was a man of moderate height with a broad, pleasant face, and the particular manner of someone who had learned early that appearing trustworthy was more useful than being trustworthy. He was perhaps 40, with gray at his temples and good clothes and a handshake that was firm and warm. He looked at Frank Rhodes with a smile that did not change and eyes that went very careful. "Rhodes," he said, "I didn't expect you." "I expect not," Frank said. "Miss Ramsey," Holt said, turning the smile fully on her. "I'm very glad you're safe. That must have been a terrible ordeal." "It was managed," she said. She let him show her into the house. She let him offer coffee and made the expected responses to his expected expressions of concern. She watched him watching Frank, who had come in behind her and stood near the door in the way of a man who has positioned himself carefully relative to the exits. Lewis had remained outside with the horses. "I imagine you're anxious to see the ranch," Holt said to her. "We can begin tomorrow when you're rested." "I'm quite rested," she said. "Actually, Mr. Holt, I'd like to speak with you about something before anything else." "Of course," he said, still with the pleasant face. She told him about the letter to Deputy Commissioner Haverford. She told him calmly, without theatrical effect, the way you tell someone information that is factual and documented and no longer under any form of dispute. She told him that the letter had been sent 9 days ago and that it included copies of the registered deeds going back 18 months and the Arizona Territory records regarding Thomas Aldridge, and that it named Holt's Land Trust specifically. The pleasant face did not disappear. She gave him credit for that. He was a man of significant control. But something behind the pleasant face underwent a change, a calculation being rapidly revised, a hand of cards being reassessed. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "The land registrations are entirely legitimate." "That will be a matter for the deputy commissioner to determine," she said. "I believe he received the letter by now. I expect we'll hear something within a few weeks." "You've been staying at Rhodes's place," Holt said. There was something in his voice now, something that was meant to suggest impropriety, to reframe the situation in terms that would cast doubt on her. "I have been recovering from my injury in a safe place," she said. "Mr. Rhodes very kindly offered his hospitality, which was medically necessary. His hands, the Esperanza brothers, were present throughout. This was true. I have nothing to be concerned about on that score. Do you?" The last question was not aggressive. It was entirely mild. And it landed the way a mild question sometimes lands harder than a sharp one. Holt looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him with the quiet steadiness that Pauline now knew was not passivity but something far more controlled than passivity. "I think," Holt said carefully, "that there has been some misrepresentation here, by one party or another." "The documentary record will sort that out," Pauline said. "In the meantime, I wanted to come and speak with you directly, as I thought that was the right thing to do. I will not be taking up residence here. I believe our arrangement was entered into under terms that were not entirely represented to me honestly, and I think you understand what I mean by that." A long pause. "You're making a mistake," Holt said. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was still there, but it was a coat now, and you could see the shape of what was underneath. "You came out here with nothing. You'll go back with nothing." "That remains to be seen," she said, and she stood, and Frank opened the door and they left. They drove back in the blue winter afternoon, and for a long time neither of them said anything, the horses moving steadily on the red road with Lewis ranging alongside and the mountains standing in the north against a sky that was turning the color of apricots toward the west. "He'll challenge it," Frank said eventually. "Yes," she agreed. "He'll challenge everything. It will take time." "I have a lawyer," Frank said, "in Santa Fe, a good one. He's been doing land work for me since I filed my original deed. I should have sent everything to him 18 months ago instead of trying to manage it myself." "You didn't have all the pieces then," she said. "You have them now." He glanced at her. The apricot light was on his face and he had his hat pushed back slightly, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had just put down something very heavy and was still figuring out what to do with his hands now that they were empty. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Now, with the arrangement gone." She had been thinking about this since before they left his ranch that morning. She had been thinking about it in the way she thought about patterns, identifying the pieces she had and the pieces she needed and the way they could fit together. "I have $32, she said. "I have a trunk of possessions. I have skills that are practical and have a market value. I have no ties in Galena that require my immediate return." She paused. "I have no ties anywhere that require anything of me in particular." Frank was quiet. "I am also," she said, "aware that you have no cook and no housekeeper, and that the Esperanza brothers are eating food that I suspect is not doing any of them credit." A sound from Frank that was, she believed, the first laugh she had heard from him. It was brief, and it was quiet, but it was real, and it changed his face in a way that did something to her chest that she decided not to analyze too closely for the moment. "That's a practical answer," he said. I am a practical woman. You are, he said. He was looking at the road ahead. I want you to know that I am not proposing an arrangement like Holt's. Whatever you decide to do, I am not. He stopped, started again. I would not make you feel like you were a piece of something someone was building. She looked at his profile against the fading western light. I know that, she said. I knew that before we left this morning. He looked at her then briefly and then back at the road. Then we'll figure out the rest, he said. Yes, she said. We will. The figuring out took the form of weeks, and the weeks had a texture that she had not expected and would not have been able to predict. She managed the house with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, quickly understanding what the household needed and providing it, not in the self-effacing way of a woman who believes her value is purely functional, but in the way of someone who is good at something and finds the exercise of competence satisfying. She cooked, and she helped Miguel repair a saddle with stitching that turned out to be considerably better than what the saddle had originally held, and she began a correspondence with a dressmaker in Springer, named Mrs. Ochoa, who had more commissions than she could fill and needed someone to handle the fine work. Frank watched all of this with his characteristic attention, and they talked in the evenings, sitting by the iron stove in the main room with coffee that was still very strong and improving food. And the talking was easy in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have changed its quality. They talked about everything and nothing, about the territory and its politics, about the cattle market and the railroad, and the ongoing questions of water rights in the dry years, about books they had read, about the particular quality of the winter light on the red earth. And in among all of this practical and comfortable and increasingly essential daily existence, something was growing that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the particular alchemy that happens between two people who have been honest with each other from nearly the beginning. She noticed things about him. The way he got up before dawn every morning and was already outside before she came to start the fire, and how he would come in cold and stamping at 6 o'clock for coffee with frost on his coat, and his face reddened by the cold and something alert in his eyes that was purely the product of having been awake and moving in the winter morning. The way he read in the evenings, slowly and with genuine engagement, turning pages as though each one had something worth paying attention to. The way he was with the Esperanza brothers, direct and fair, and with a particular dry humor that Louis in particular appreciated enormously. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression she could not fully read but which had warmth in it and something more tentative underneath the warmth. The expression of a man who has learned to be careful with what he wants because the history of wanting things and losing them is written on him in ways that don't fully wash off. She understood that history. She understood the caution it produced. She felt something similar herself, the learned wariness of a woman who had managed her own life in a world that did not make managing your own life easy, and who had developed as a consequence a deep suspicion of the distance between how things looked and how they were. Frank Rhodes looked like a man she could trust. More importantly, he was a man she could trust, and she had enough evidence by now to be certain of that distinction. One evening in early December, when the cold had settled in for what felt like permanence and the snow on the mountains had come down to the foothills, and the world outside was dark and still, he came in later than usual. She had kept dinner warm. She had not quite admitted to herself that she had been listening for the sound of the barn door. He sat down at the table and she set the plate in front of him and she poured coffee and then she sat across from him and she said, "Something happened." It was not a question. He looked at her. He nodded. "Rider came from Springer," he said. "Letter from my lawyer in Santa Fe. The Deputy Commissioner's office has opened a formal investigation into the Holt Land Trust registrations. Haverford himself is coming to the territory in January." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "They also sent a letter to Aldridge's office in Cimarron, official correspondence." "Aldridge left Cimarron 3 days ago. No one knows where he went," she absorbed this. "Holt?" she asked. "Holt is still at his ranch," Frank said. "Cooperating with the preliminary inquiry, my lawyer says, presenting himself as a man who was badly advised by a dishonest attorney. He'll try to make Aldridge the exclusive cause," she said. "Yes," Frank said. "Whether it works depends on what Haverford finds when he looks at the deeds directly." "The deeds are clear," she said. "We found them." "Yes," he said, "we found them." He looked at her across the table, and she felt the weight of that "we" in a way she had not expected. Not the legal or practical weight of it, but the personal weight. The weight of having had someone beside her in this. Someone who was there not because she was useful to them, but because they were useful to each other in the full sense. The sense that includes being seen and being known. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about the way she had sat in the lamplight of the lined shack and heard him say, "I have not spoken that name aloud in years," and about how she had understood without being told that this was a man carrying a wound that had not fully closed, and about how she had sat with him in the silence of it because sitting with someone in their silence is one of the most intimate things you can do. "Frank," she said. He looked at her. "I came west with a plan," she said. "The plan did not work out the way I intended." "No," he said. "I find that I am not unhappy about that," she said. A pause. He was very still. "I find," she said more carefully, "that what has happened instead is better than what I planned. Not in the practical sense, though the practical situation is not without its merits." She was watching his face, and she saw the careful, controlled hope in it, the hope of a man who has learned that hope is a thing to be approached cautiously. In this she stopped, because she did not have a word for it that was not too large for the kitchen table and the coffee cups and the ordinary winter evening. "In the larger sense," she said finally. "Pauline," he said. Her name in his mouth had a quality she could not describe, something like the first use of a word you have known for a long time in the language you are actually thinking in. "I know we have not spoken about this," she said. "I know there is a great deal that is still uncertain, with the legal proceedings and everything else." "None of that uncertainty affects this," he said, and the plainness of it, the directness, the complete absence of performance, hit her somewhere below the careful practical surface she maintained. "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose it does." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was warm and rough and absolutely steady, and she turned her hand over under his and held on, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the thing that needed to be said had already been said, in the way that the most important things are sometimes said, without quite being spoken. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the fire was banked, he walked her to the door of the bedroom, and she turned to face him in the dark hallway with the smell of wood smoke and cold air around them, and he looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had learned to read, the one with the warmth and the hope underneath the careful surface, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was a quiet kiss. It was not rushed. It was the kiss of a man who understood that some things are worth taking slowly, and it tasted of coffee and of everything that had been building between them over the past weeks, and she felt, in the moment of it, a great settled rightness that she had not felt about many things in her life and that she recognized as something to pay attention to. He pulled back and looked at her. "Good night, Pauline," he said. "Good night, Frank," she said. She lay in the dark bedroom for a long time after, listening to the house settle in the cold, and she thought about what it means to arrive somewhere you did not know you were going, and how the accidents of a life, the overturned wagon, the borrowed blanket, the name spoken in lamplight, the silence kept after it, can turn out to be not accidents at all but the actual shape of the thing itself rather than the deviation from it. She thought that she was, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, exactly where she was supposed to be. Deputy Commissioner Haverford arrived in the territory in the second week of January 1883, and he was a methodical and serious man who spent 3 weeks examining documents and taking testimony. And at the end of those 3 weeks, he issued a preliminary ruling that suspended 3 of the Holt Land Trust registrations, pending full federal review, and recommended the referral of 2 additional registrations to the Territorial District Court for adjudication of boundary conflicts. It was not a complete victory. These things rarely are in the immediate term, but it was the beginning of the unraveling, and both Frank and Pauline understood it as such. Holt tried, in the weeks that followed, to negotiate with Frank directly, approaching through intermediaries with offers of settlement that Frank's lawyer evaluated carefully and found inadequate. Holt tried to reframe the situation publicly, presenting himself in the Springer newspaper as a businessman wronged by a rogue attorney. The county largely did not believe him, partly because Frank's record in the county was clean and his relationships with his neighbors were good, and partly because several of those neighbors had been noticing the same creeping registrations and were glad to see them questioned. Thomas Aldridge was found in Colorado, in Pueblo, 6 weeks after he had left Cimarron. He was arrested on a warrant from Arizona Territory, where the original deed fraud had finally, after years, risen to the level of a prosecutable case. He was extradited in February. Frank did not attend the proceedings. He said he had no need to see that particular man again, and that whatever the Arizona courts decided was no longer a matter that required his presence. Pauline thought this was the right decision. She said so. He looked at her when she said it in the way he had of looking at her, and he said, "I think I have spent enough time in the past." She understood this completely. Gerald Holt ultimately settled the federal land dispute in April, returning the contested water rights to their proper designation and ceding the 40 acres of overlapping boundary claim. He did this through his lawyers in a process that was cold and formal and entirely without the pleasant face he had shown in his ranch house in November. He remained in the territory because leaving would have been an admission of something, but his influence in the county diminished steadily over the following year, because reputation in small country is a fragile thing once it begins to go. In March, Frank asked Pauline to marry him. He asked her in the kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning, which was not, by any convention she had ever encountered, the traditional setting for a proposal. He had come in from the early cold as usual with frost on his coat, and she had handed him his coffee as usual, and he had taken it, and then instead of drinking it, he had set it down and looked at her with the expression she loved, the one with all of it in it, the steadiness and the warmth and the careful hope, and he had said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that the answer you give is the only consideration, not the situation or the practicality of anything." "Just what you want." "All right," she said. "Will you marry me?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the Santa Fe Railroad in Springer in late October with $32 in her corset and a plan that had not worked out the way she intended. She thought about what she had found instead. "Yes," she said, "I will." He smiled then, the full smile, not the brief quiet one she had seen occasionally, but the real one, and it changed his face entirely, opening it in a way that she thought must be what he had looked like before 11 years of partnership and betrayal and rebuilding had put the careful lines in it, and she thought that she would spend a considerable amount of the rest of her life earning that smile. They were married in Springer in April of 1883, at the small church on the main street, with the Esperanza brothers in attendance and Mrs. Ochoa the dressmaker, who had become Pauline's closest friend in the territory, and a number of Frank's neighbors and fellow ranchers who came in their best clothes and wished them well with the directness of people who spend their lives in places where pretense is a luxury the country does not support. Pauline wore a dress she had made herself, fine cream wool with a collar of ivory lace that she had brought with her from Galena in her trunk, and she thought as she walked down the short aisle that the lace had been waiting for this without knowing it, the way some things wait for their right purpose. Frank was wearing his good coat and his boots were clean, and he was standing at the front of the church looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and would remember always, something completely unguarded, completely present without the careful surface. The whole of him visible in a way that was. She understood in that moment what he had been building toward in her presence since the beginning, the slow trust, the careful increment of openness. The deliberate choice to let himself be seen. She reached him. She took his hand. The words were said. The ring was placed, a simple gold band he had commissioned from a jeweler in Santa Fe. She felt it settle onto her finger with the same quality of rightness she had felt in the hallway in December, the recognition of something that fits. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon of the wedding day, just the two of them, with the April sun warm on the red earth and the mountains still carrying their winter white at the peaks, and the sage coming in green and sharp-smelling after a recent rain, and the land around them enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And she sat beside him on the wagon bench, and he held the reins in one hand and her hand in the other. And she thought that this was not the life she had planned, and that this was entirely and perfectly all right. That evening, with the ranch quiet around them and the first stars coming up over the eastern mountains, she stood on the porch and Frank came out and stood beside her, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the stars together in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have learned each other's silences. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered it genuinely, as she considered everything. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I expected to be again," he said. There was something in it, not sadness, but the acknowledgement of the distance traveled, the cost of it, and the fact that having arrived was more remarkable because of how far and difficult the way had been. She turned to look at him. "You are going to have to stop being surprised by it," she said. He looked at her, the hint of that smile. "I'll work on it," he said. She stood on her toes and kissed him, there on the porch in the starlight, and he held her with both arms and kissed her back. And the night was large around them, and the land stretched away in all directions, and none of it felt threatening or isolating the way it had in October from a wagon bench with a stranger driving toward an uncertain future. It felt like home. The spring moved into summer, and summer in New Mexico territory was its own kind of revelation. The mornings sharp and cool and the afternoons burning, and the thunderstorms that came up in the afternoon off the mountains, massive and spectacular, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in 20 minutes, and soaking the earth and the sage and the red clay roads, and then passing as quickly as they came, leaving the world washed and bright and smelling of juniper and wet stone. Pauline had grown up in Illinois, where the land was flat and green and abundantly watered, where the scale was human and managed and familiar. The New Mexico territory landscape had frightened her in those first days, its scale, its aridness, its apparent indifference to human presence. She had thought of it as a place that did not particularly want to be inhabited. She had changed her mind. She understood now that it was not indifference but honesty, a landscape that showed you what it was without apology, and asked only that you meet it on its own terms, and that there was a particular pleasure in being equal to that, in learning the terms and finding that you could live within them not just adequately but fully. The dressmaking work with Mrs. Ochoa had grown into a genuine arrangement. Mrs. Ochoa supplied the local commissions and Pauline did the fine work, and she was building a reputation in the county for quality that was beginning to bring in requests from Springer, and even as far as Cimarron. She did this work at the table in the main room of the ranch house in the mornings while Frank was out on the range, and there was something she liked about the rhythm of it, the fine needlework, the problem of a difficult cut, the satisfaction of a seam pressed flat and perfect, combined with the knowledge that when he came in at noon, she would hear the boots on the porch and the door, and that was its own kind of pleasure. She wrote to her mother in Galena in the summer, a long letter, the kind she had not written before because there had not been the material for it. She wrote about Frank, about the land, about what her life had become, and she tried to be honest in the letter about the fear she had felt on the Cimarron road and the cold night in the line shack, and the way everything had gone entirely wrong and then, because of a name spoken aloud and a silence kept, had become something she had not imagined. Her mother wrote back in August. It was a short letter in the direct way of her mother's correspondence, and it said in its last line, "I did not expect this for you, Pauline. I am very glad to have been wrong." She showed the letter to Frank. He read it and nodded. "Your mother seems like a practical woman," he said. "She had to be," Pauline said. "Where do you think you got it?" he said. She looked at him. He was reading again, his book open on his knee, and he said it without looking up, the dry, quiet humor of it perfectly calibrated. And she felt a wave of something that was so simple and strong that she thought there must be a word for it in some language, the feeling of being known, specifically and completely and with affection, by a person whose knowing matters to you. "Probably from her," she said. He looked up, the hint of the smile. "Probably," he agreed. In September she told him she was pregnant. She had been fairly certain for 3 weeks and absolutely certain for 1, and she had been thinking about how to tell him in the way she thought about things she cared about deeply, carefully, and from several angles. In the end she told him in the kitchen in the morning, which was apparently where important things happened between them, because that was where he had proposed, and this felt similarly unpremeditated, the right moment presenting itself without ceremony. She told him simply. He went very still. Not the controlled stillness she had seen when the name hit him in the lined shack, not the stillness of something held in place, but a different kind entirely, the stillness of something being taken in. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, layered in a way she needed a moment to understand, joy at the surface and something deeper under it, something like wonder, the particular wonder of a man who had expected less and received more, and is still in the process of believing his own good fortune. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her with a gentleness and a completeness that made her think of the way he built things, his fences, his plans, with thoroughness and care and the intention that they would last. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "You're well." "I'm very well," she said. "I'm strong, Frank, don't fuss." "I'm going to fuss," he said, still not letting go. "Briefly," she said, "and then we will be practical about it." "Briefly," he agreed. He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes were very bright. "A baby," he said. "In approximately April," she said. "I believe." "April," he said. He seemed to be testing the word for weight. "The ranch will be busy in April," she said. "The calving." "The ranch," he said, "can manage." He touched her face with one hand, the rough, careful touch she had become as familiar with as her own name. "You are the most important thing on this property, Pauline." She felt her eyes go hot and blinked it away because she was not a woman who wept easily, but it was a near thing. "I know," she said, "and you are good for saying so." "It's only true," he said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was milder than the previous one, which felt like a particular mercy. Louis's wife, Consuela, who had come to live at the ranch in October when Louis and Miguel's parents moved north to Taos, became a daily presence that Pauline was grateful for in the way of genuine friendship rather than mere proximity. Consuela was 5 years older than Pauline, with a directness that matched Pauline's own and a knowledge of the territory and its particular ways that Pauline was glad to learn from. She had grown up on a rancho south of Santa Fe, and she understood the land and the seasons and the particular domestic science of managing a household in a place where nothing came easily or quickly. They spent the dark winter afternoons together sometimes, Pauline with her sewing and Consuela with her own work, and they talked in the comfortable way of women who have recognized each other as equals. And Pauline thought that this was another thing she had not planned for and was deeply glad of. Frank spent the winter months doing the accounting and planning work that the ranch required, working through the detailed projections for the spring with a focus and competence that reminded her of what he had said about the ranch in Arizona territory. 5 years of building with his hands and his back, and the kind of belief that has nothing reasonable backing it up. He had built here for 3 years before she arrived, and he was building still, and now they were building together, and the particular quality of doing something with another person who shares your understanding of what it is and what it is for is one of the finer things available to human beings. In February, a letter came from Santa Fe with the final resolution of the land dispute. The Federal Review had concluded. The contested water rights were formally restored to their original designation, split equally between Frank's holding and the public range, with no portion to the Holt Land Trust. The overlapping boundary claim was dissolved in Frank's favor with an order requiring Holt to pay the costs of the survey that had been required to document it. It was not, the letter from Frank's lawyer noted, a complete accounting of the damage Holt had done over 18 months of registration maneuvering, but it was the most the law could provide, and it was clean and it was final. Frank read the letter at the table and then set it down and put both hands flat on the table, not in the way she had seen him do in November when his jaw was tight and his face was controlled against something enormous, but differently, a man putting his hands on a surface and feeling that it is solid, that it holds. "It's done," he said. "It is," she said. "Both of them," he said. "Aldridge in Arizona, Holt here." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "You found the original deed irregularity," he said. "The water rights registration. I had been looking at those documents for months and I didn't find it. You found it in 3 days. You were too close to it," she said. "You knew too much and it made it harder to see." "No," he said. "I was too close to the anger of it. You were clear." He paused. "You saved this place, Pauline." She considered deflecting this and decided against it because he was speaking a true thing and deflecting true things was a habit she was trying to break. "We saved it," she said. "Together." He held her gaze for a moment. "Together," he agreed. Their son was born on the 15th of April, 1884, which was, as Pauline had predicted, a busy time on the ranch with the calving beginning. Frank was at her side through the labor, which Consuela assisted with and which was long but not complicated, and at the end of it, Frank held his son for the first time with an expression on his face that she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life, the complete unguarded openness of it, the tenderness. They named him James William Rhodes, James for Frank's father, who had died when Frank was 16, William for no particular reason except that they both liked it. James was a solid and vocal infant who made his opinions about the world known with considerable enthusiasm, and who, from his first months, had his father's brown eyes and his mother's methodical determination, the latter of which became evident quite early in his persistent and eventually successful efforts to get to anything he was not supposed to have. Frank was, with James, exactly the kind of father Pauline had privately believed he would be, present and warm, and entirely undaunted by the noise and chaos of a small person discovering the world. He held James on the porch in the evenings and talked to him about the land, explaining the mountains and the weather and the business of cattle in the patient, reasonable way he explained everything. And Pauline stood in the doorway and watched this, and felt something that was not quite describable, and was in the general territory of complete. Louis and Consuela's first child, a daughter named Maria Elena, arrived 3 months after James, and the two households were knit together in the shared experience of new parenthood in a way that deepened the friendship between the couples into something that felt, in the way of the best relationships, permanent. The spring and summer and fall of 1884 passed in the full and ordinary way of a life that is being lived rather than merely managed. There were difficulties, because there are always difficulties. A dry summer that made the pasture short and required moving the cattle south for 6 weeks. A bout of illness that laid Frank low for 10 days in July and frightened her more than she let show. A problem with a fence line that took a month to resolve with a difficult neighbor to the east. These things were handled, one by one, in the methodical and collaborative way that she and Frank had developed, each of them bringing what they had to the problem, and the problems yielding. In the evenings, in the main room with the fire going and James asleep in his crib, they read and talked, and were quiet together in the way she had always known, somewhere below her practical surface, was the best version of what a life with another person could be. Not the performed closeness of strangers trying to become intimate quickly, not the comfortable distance of people who have stopped paying attention to each other, but the genuine and ongoing discovery of a person who continues to surprise and interest you because they are fully themselves and fully present. She learned, across those months, the rest of his silences. She learned that the particular quiet he held on early mornings was not sadness, but something like prayer, the private orientation of himself toward the day. She learned that, when he was working through a problem, he would get up and walk, sometimes for an hour, and come back with the solution or the beginning of it. She learned that he read poetry sometimes, late at night when he thought she was asleep, and that he did not mention this because he was mildly embarrassed about it, and that when she told him she had noticed, and that she thought it was not something to be embarrassed about, he looked at her with the brief, genuine surprise of a man who has been seen in something he had kept private and found the seeing kind rather than exposing. She told him things, too. She told him about the years when her mother had been most reduced, when the house in Galena had been truly barely maintained, and she had been 16 and 17, and had understood with a clarity that no 16-year-old should have to understand exactly what it means to have the margin run out. She told him about the pride that had made it impossible to tell anyone about this, and about the loneliness of that pride. She told him about the men she had thought she might marry in the years before the advertisement and what had stopped each possibility, which was in each case some version of the same thing, the recognition that she would be agreeing to a life that was someone else's idea of a life rather than her own. "You knew what you wanted," he said. "I knew what I didn't want," she said. "I didn't know what I wanted until I had it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what you mean," he said. She believed that he did. James turned one in April of 1885, which was celebrated with something approximating a cake, given the limitations of the ranch kitchen, and with the attendance of the Esperanza family and two neighboring ranch families who had become friends over the past year and a half. James himself was unimpressed by the celebration, and very impressed by the horse Lewis's eldest son brought to show him, reaching toward it with both hands and a focused intensity that made everyone laugh. That summer, Pauline received a letter from her mother saying that her health was beginning to fail, not alarmingly, not immediately, but in the way of a woman in her 60s who has worked very hard for many years and is beginning to feel the accumulated cost of it. The letter was not dramatic. Her mother was not a dramatic woman, but Pauline read what was between the lines. She showed it to Frank. He read it and then said, "Write and ask her to come here." Pauline looked at him. "The house has room," he said. "The land would do her good if the altitude agrees with her, and you would not have to choose between your life and her." She had not asked this of him. She had not even let herself fully form the desire in specific terms because she had not wanted to ask something that might be too much, that might tip some balance. But he was saying it before she asked, and it was not a performance of generosity. It was simply the practical and generous thing, said in the direct way of a man who had decided it was right. "Are you certain?" she said. "I would not say it if I weren't," he said, which was entirely true. Her mother, Pauline Ramsey, arrived in the territory in September of 1885 on the Santa Fe Railroad and was met at Springer by Frank and Pauline and James, who sat on the wagon bench between them with his boots not reaching the footboard and his hat too large for his head, regarding his grandmother's arrival with the focused solemnity of a small boy confronting a new thing. Pauline Ramsey was 62 and somewhat smaller than Pauline remembered, reduced by age in the way of some people without being diminished, the essential quality of her still fully present, the sharp eyes and the dry manner, and the clear-sighted way of looking at what was in front of her. She shook Frank's hand on the platform and looked at him directly for a long moment and then said, "You look capable." "I try to be," Frank said. "Good," she said, and got into the wagon. She settled into ranch life with a matter-of-factness that would have surprised people who did not know her but did not surprise Pauline at all. She was useful where she could be, rested when she needed to, and was a grandmother to James with a warmth that she had not always had time to be a mother with, because circumstances had not always allowed it. And Pauline recognized in watching it a gift that was possible now because of everything that had had to happen first. Frank treated Alina with a respectful and genuine consideration that Alina acknowledged in her way by telling Pauline privately, "He is a good man. You were right not to settle for less." "I didn't plan it," Pauline said. "No," her mother said. "The best things generally can't be planned. You have to be ready for them when they come." In the fall of 1885, Frank filed the final paperwork with the county recorder that officially consolidated the Mesa Verde claim with 3 adjacent parcels he had been able to acquire over the previous 2 years through straightforward and legitimate purchase. The ranch, now a coherent and viable holding of just over 800 acres with secure water rights and good pasture, and the prospect of continued growth. He brought the filed copies home and put them on the table and looked at them. Pauline poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. 800 acres, she said. Started with 240, he said. I know, she said. She had heard the story in pieces across 2 years of evenings. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the documents. She watched him look at them, and she thought about the man in Arizona territory who had built something and had it taken, and the man who had come to New Mexico and started again, and the man who had ridden down into an arroyo on a cold November morning and found her, half frozen and absolutely determined not to show how frightened she was. Thomas Aldridge got 3 years in the Arizona prison, Frank said. I got 800 acres and you and James and your mother in the front bedroom. He paused. I think I got the better deal. She felt the warmth of it move through her. Considerably better, she said. He looked at her and smiled, the full smile, the one that changed his face, and she thought, as she had thought many times, that she would never tire of earning that smile, that it would remain a project worth pursuing for as long as they were both alive. By the winter of 1886, Alina's health had stabilized in a way that the high, dry air of the territory seemed to support, the doctor and Springer remarking that she appeared considerably stronger than the letters from her Illinois physician had suggested she would be. She helped Pauline with the sewing work in the mornings, her hands still able for the plain work if not the finest, and she read to James in the afternoons, and in the evenings she played cards with Frank in a game of rummy that had developed into an ongoing competition of cheerful ruthlessness, Alina being a card player of considerable skill and absolutely no mercy, which Frank found genuinely amusing, and which James watched from his spot on the floor with his wooden horse, absorbing the adult world. In December of that year, Pauline told Frank she was pregnant again. He received this with the same quality he had received the first news, the stillness, the taking in, and then the full warmth of it, though this time there was in it also the ease of a man who has experience of the thing and knows the shape of it, knows what it asks and what it gives. March or April again, she said. March would be better for the calving, he said gravely. I will do my best to cooperate with the ranch calendar, she said. He laughed. Fully and without reservation. The laugh that she had heard increasingly across the years, and that was one of the finest sounds she knew. Their daughter was born in late March of 1887, which was in fact moderately inconvenient for the calving but entirely acceptable, and she came into the world at 5 o'clock in the morning with a vigorous and well-articulated opinion about it, which Pauline thought was probably appropriate. They named her Alina after her grandmother, but called her Ellie from the first days because James, who was 3 and deeply interested in the new person, called her this, and it stuck. Alina, the grandmother, held baby Ellie on the first afternoon and looked at her with an expression that Pauline would think about later, the expression of a woman who has reached the end of a long and not entirely easy life and found, in the last chapters of it, more than she had expected to find, an abundance she had not counted on. James regarded his sister with the complex feelings of a 3-year-old negotiating the presence of a competitor and ultimately decided, across the following weeks, that she was acceptable, particularly when she began to be able to track him with her eyes, which seemed to him to confirm that she understood what was important. Frank held Ellie in the evenings on the porch in the same way he had held James, talking to her about the land, the mountains, the weather, the particulars of the cattle operation, and Ellie listened with the serious attention of a person who intends to understand exactly where she has arrived and what it requires of her. The ranch in those years was a working and productive thing. The 800 acres managed well, the cattle herd steady, the income from the herd supplemented by Pauline's dressmaking work, and by a small but growing enterprise of selling fine, hand-stitched goods through a Springer dry goods merchant who had discovered there was a market for quality work among the wives of the more prosperous ranchers and merchants in the county. She hired 2 young women from Springer to help with the plain work, which freed her for the fine pieces and for the management of the enterprise itself, which she found she had a considerable aptitude for. Frank watched this with open admiration, and without any of the particular discomfort that some men of the era would have felt about a wife who ran her own business. He had understood from the first days who she was, a capable woman who worked, and he had never suggested this should be otherwise, because he was not a man who confused his own comfort with what was right. "You are going to need a separate workroom," he said in the spring of 1888, looking at the bolts of fabric and the pattern papers and the ongoing projects that were increasingly filling the main room. "The house won't hold it much longer." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "We could extend the east side," he said. "Put in a proper workroom with good light. That would cost." "We have it," he said, "or we will have it by fall after the cattle sale." She looked at him. "It's your business, Pauline," he said simply. "It should have the space it needs to grow." The workroom was built that fall, a proper room on the east side of the house with 2 windows facing south and east for the light, and a long table and shelving, and a second iron stove for winter work. And when it was finished, she stood in it and looked at the light coming through the windows onto the clean wooden floor and felt, as she had felt in various forms over the past 6 years, the particular quality of a life that is genuinely and wholly her own. Her own in the way that being fully known and fully supported makes a life your own, not the life you planned or the life you managed or the life you escaped into, but the life you actually are. In the summer of 1889, New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, a process that was slow and politically complicated, but that was filling the newspapers and the conversations in every town and ranch and homestead across the territory. Frank followed the statehood politics with interest and had opinions about it, and he and Pauline talked about it in the evenings with the combined attention they brought to everything they both cared about, which was a pleasure that had not diminished across the years but had, if anything, become richer for having the full context of each other to draw on. James was 5 and beginning to show the particular qualities that would define him: Frank's steadiness and Pauline's quick, clear intelligence, and something that was neither of them exactly, a sociability, a genuine interest in other people that seemed to be entirely his own. He had 3 particular friends among the children of neighboring families, and he managed those friendships with the easy confidence of a child who has always felt secure. Ellie was 2 and an absolute force of nature, a small, determined person who was already making clear that she intended to understand and participate in everything that happened within her radius, and who showed no particular inclination to remain within the radius adults assigned her. Eleanor, the grandmother's health held through the summer of 1889, though she was slower than she had been, and she tired more easily. She knew it and she spoke of it without fear, in the direct way she spoke of everything, and she continued to play rummy with Frank every evening, and to read to the children in the afternoons, and to be exactly who she had always been in every way that mattered. She died in October of 1889, quietly in her sleep, in the front bedroom that had been hers for 4 years. She had been more comfortable than she would have been in Galena, The ranch doctor said, and the territory had been good for her lungs. She had had, the doctor said, more time here than she would have had elsewhere. Pauline grieved her with the focused completeness she brought to everything, not holding it back, not managing it away, but letting it be what it was, the loss of the woman who had made her and who had in the last years been able to receive in return some of what she had given. Frank was with her through all of it, steady and present and not trying to fix what could not be fixed, only being there, which was what was needed and what he knew how to give. They buried Pauline Ramsey on the ranch property, on a small rise to the east of the house where you could see the mountains. It was where she had liked to sit in the mornings with her coffee, watching the mountains change color in the early light, and it seemed right. The winter that followed was quiet, and the spring that came after it was gentle, and the land went on doing what the land does, indifferent and immense, and in its indifference somehow comforting, because a thing that has been here this long and will be here this long provides a kind of scale against which even the largest griefs are proportionate. James went to the school in Springer in the fall of 1890, riding in with Lewis on Monday mornings and back on Friday afternoons, and he thrived there in the way of children who have been well prepared, reading before most of his classmates, and with an arithmetic that the schoolteacher, a serious woman named Miss Barnes, noted in a letter to Pauline was remarkable. Ellie waited for school with an impatience that she was not shy about expressing. Frank laughed at her impatience and taught her letters in the evenings at the table, and she absorbed them with a focused hunger that reminded him, he said one evening, of her mother. "She is not going to be easy," Pauline said, watching Ellie work through a new word with her tongue between her teeth. "No," Frank agreed. He was smiling. "She is going to be wonderful." In 1891, Pauline's sewing enterprise had grown enough that she was effectively running a small business with 3 employees and a steady clientele across 2 counties, and she had taken on an arrangement with a Santa Fe merchant who stocked her finest pieces and sold them to the wives of the territorial capital's professional and political class. This was a source of satisfaction that ran alongside and was entirely compatible with everything else her life was, her marriage, her children, the ranch, the friendships, the land itself. She wrote about it in a letter to a childhood friend in Galena, trying to describe what it was like to have built something, to have made something from the pieces available to her, and she found as she wrote that the word she returned to was unexpectedly. "I did not expect this," she wrote, "not any of it. Not the place or the work or the man I married or the children we have or the feeling, which I can only describe as fullness, of a life that has turned out to be more than I planned." She paused over the letter. She thought about the name spoken aloud in the lamplight of a lined shack and the silence she had kept after it, and how that silence had been the beginning of the whole long, intricate, beautiful thing. She finished the letter and sealed it. Frank was on the porch when she went out with the finished letter for the rider who would take it to Springer. He was sitting in the chair he had built 2 summers ago with his coffee, looking at the evening mountains. James was somewhere in the barn. Ellie was asleep, finally, having fought sleep with her usual vigor. She sat down in the chair beside his. He handed her the coffee cup and she took a sip and handed it back. "Good letter?" he asked. "I think so," she said. He nodded. The mountains were going purple and rose in the last of the light. The air was very clear, the particular clarity of the territory at the end of a warm day, and you could hear the cattle somewhere to the south and the sound of James's voice in the barn talking to Lewis's youngest, who spent a great deal of time following James around with the devotion of a small faithful dog. "Frank," she said. "Pauline," he said. It was something they did sometimes. The simple names back and forth, not as a question or an answer, but as an acknowledgement, as a reminder, as the simplest possible statement of the central fact. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about that first morning," he said. "In the arroyo, you were lying there with that blanket pulled up to your chin and you looked at me like you were calculating exactly how much you could trust me and exactly what you needed to know before you decided." "I was," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought, here is a woman who does not do anything without understanding what it is." "And was that a good thing?" she asked. "From where you were sitting, it was the most remarkable thing I'd seen in years," he said. He looked at the mountains. "I had stopped expecting to be surprised," he said, "by people, by anything. I had been careful for a long time and I was tired, but I didn't know I was tired. And then I found you in that arroyo and you looked at me the way you did and said, 'Can you tell me how far the nearest shelter is?' Like that was the most practical question available, which it was, and I thought." He stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought I am in trouble," he said. She laughed. Quietly, the laugh she had that was fully her own, unperformed, genuine. "Were you?" "Completely," he said. He looked at her then in the last of the evening light, with the expression she had loved since she first learned to read it, the full warmth of it, the careful hope transformed over 8 years of building together into something settled and strong and ongoing. "I still am," he said, "in the best possible way." She reached across and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. The stars were coming out over the mountains, the great dense sweep of them that you could never see properly in a city, only out here where there was enough dark to see by. And the land spread away from the porch in every direction, 800 acres of it. Theirs, built from what had been possible and what had been found in an arroyo, and what had been chosen each day after that with full knowledge and full willingness. She thought of the lined shack. She thought of the letter she had written on impulse, and the overturned wagon and the cold, and all the things that had gone wrong so perfectly that they became the right things. She thought of a name spoken aloud after years of silence, and a silence kept after it, and how those two things, the speaking and the not speaking, had been the hinge on which everything had turned. She thought that the word for what she had was not luck, not exactly, though luck had played its part. The word was more like recognition. The recognition when you encounter something real that it is real, and the choice to stay with it rather than retreat to what is merely manageable. She had recognized Frank Rhodes. He had recognized her. The rest had been the work of time and trust and the daily choice to keep building, which was, she thought, the most accurate description of love she had found. James came out of the barn and saw them on the porch and waved and went back inside. The sound of him laughing at something came across the yard in the clear evening air. Inside, Ellie was sleeping with the absolute determination of a child who has used up every ounce of energy available and will not be moved until morning, when she would wake fully charged and immediately begin investigating everything within reach. The coffee cup sat between them on the porch railing. The mountains held their purple in the darkening sky. Frank's hand was warm in hers. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she had imagined when she folded $32 into the lining of her corset and stepped onto a train heading west. It was larger than that life, and quieter and more demanding and more sustaining, and entirely hers in the way that things are yours when you have chosen them with your eyes open and continue to choose them every day after. She would continue to choose it tomorrow. She was already looking forward to it. The mountains went dark and the stars took the sky, and the ranch settled into the sounds of a night that was simply and perfectly ordinary, the sounds of animals and wind and a family at rest in a place they had made their own. And Pauline Ramsey Rhodes sat on the porch with her husband's hand in hers and breathed the cool September air and let the fullness of it be exactly what it was. Complete. Closed. Hers.